1 year ago, and I was finally going to have my arrangement performed. I was finally going to have it rehearsed. I was so excited. I had spent months and months making sure it was as perfect as possible and that each part was as good as possible. So the day came. It was in music class, and everything got handed out, and then we tried to run it, and we got to like bar 8 and just couldn't keep going because it sucked. The actual composition was just fine. The structure, the chords, everything like that was just fine. It was just the parts. The parts were not fair. The parts were not fun. They weren't good. And since that point, over the past year, I have studied, learned, and practiced a lot about this art of making good parts for good players. So in this video, I'm going to tell you everything that I have learned regarding how to make parts. Let's get into it. First of all, let's focus on the fundamentals. And by that, I mean instrument ranges and registers, as well as instrument limits, strengths, and weaknesses. And of course, for this, I'm not going to go over every single possible instrument and then tell you all of their parameters. I'm going to tell you instead to, after this video, try and find online resources or like some sort of orchestration manual to really help you figure out everything here. Because just like sort of guessing it isn't gonna work. So make sure that you really study these things before writing any music for that instrument, for that specific part. That's just the fundamentals though. Let's move on to the second section, which is know thy players. By this, I mean you should know who you are composing for, who these parts are for specifically. And if you know exactly the people which you are composing for, that's awesome, because then you can talk to them about their specific limitations, strengths, and weaknesses. But oftentimes you won't know exactly who you are writing this for. Therefore, you kind of have to assume those parameters based off general skill levels, as well as, of course, the ensemble in which you are writing for. So these are two things which you must get down in a very, very specific way. First of all, what ensemble are you writing for? Is it orchestra, string quartet, band? And then which skill level? So like beginner, intermediate, professional? Are you writing any sort of concerto with a advanced soloist? Keep all those things in mind when writing parts for these people. And of course, once again, there are many resources online as well as orchestration manuals that talk about these specific limitations for each skill level for each ensemble. Even a quick Google search could tell you so much and then prevent you a lot of trial and error from guessing on your own. And of course, one quick tip too, and that is when you're writing for a part, you're not really writing for an instrument. You are writing for a person who is playing that instrument. I know this sounds super obvious, but like with all of this computer playback and stuff, like it just seems like you are writing for some faceless, emotionless, thoughtless instrument, when in reality you are writing for a human being who has very specific limitations, strengths, and weaknesses. So make sure, like, instead of say you were writing for flute 2, don't think of that as just second flute player. Think of that as like an actual human, not just a stave. Next up, ignore computer playback. As young composers, we don't quite have a fully developed internal orchestra. By this I mean is that many experienced composers have decades and decades of experience and knowledge, which all contributes to their internal orchestra, allowing them to hear their own piece without any playback at all, whether digital or live. But because we are quite new still, we oftentimes rely on this computer-generated playback. That reliance can be very detrimental to our work. Because of course, even the best instrument libraries out there are not perfectly human. They are not just, nothing can replicate a human fully. Therefore, you need to focus on what's specifically written down and not just focus on how it sounds through your speakers or through your headphones because of the computer playback. And of course, once again, consult reliable resources when making your decisions. And as we gain more experience, we will begin to create that internal orchestra within our heads more and more vividly. Next up is quite a touchy subject, and that involves rests, especially the multi-measure rests. And as the composer or orchestrator, we need to know when to put these large rest times and when perhaps to avoid rest. So let's start with when to avoid rest. And of course, this completely depends on the ensemble. For an orchestra, it is quite common to have quite large rests, especially for longer pieces like a symphony, where oftentimes, say, the heavy brass will have entire tacits for certain movements. However, in a chamber work or concert band, it is far more common for there to be a lot of tutti where everyone is playing at once or almost everyone is playing at once, where oftentimes having long rests can be detrimental, especially if the length of the piece is shorter. Just imagine playing a piece that is 100 bars long, but you, as say trombone 2 or something, only get 20 bars of actual playing. Even if those 20 bars are quite important, that's only 20% of the total piece. Of course, depending on certain situations, this could still work. Like, this could still be very, very natural, but would you want to be that player who just sort of rests a lot mainly? But it all depends on the situations, of course. And if you were writing for younger players, this is something especially important to keep in mind because younger players have trouble counting really long rest times and will often get distracted. So make sure that you keep rest a small amount, maybe 4 to like 8 bars for the more concert band / younger player ensembles. Not saying that band is just for kids, but like, you get what I mean. But you also must consider where to put longer rests, and that is usually after some sort of solo or very technically demanding passage. If you were that player who just played a very, very difficult solo line, you would probably want to have plenty of time to rest. So make sure to keep that in mind too. But at the end of the day, just do what works best. Make sure to keep a balance and make sure everyone gets plenty of like play time and, most importantly, important play time. Always prioritize that over everything else. Next up, let's talk about how to destroy boredom within your parts, because it is easy for us to give a certain part very just boring stuff to play, like a lot of half notes, a lot of whole notes, no melody. That is especially a really triggering one. No melody, no solos, nothing. And oftentimes, if a player is just playing something super boring, like, they won't feel valued. They won't feel that you care about them as the composer. And of course, you could say that I made that part boring because I didn't have any real use for that specific part. But if you didn't have any important uses for it, then why did you include it in the first place? So keep that in mind. So a good way to destroy boredom is to have a balance between simpler passages and more technically demanding ones. So say some like harmonic passages of just playing these whole notes followed by some quick runs perhaps, and then a solo, some rest, and then more harmony playing. Just that sort of thing. Just something like that. Keep it balanced. Always pay attention to those individual parts to see where things line up and just how things work. And that is another thing, how most notation programs allow you to view the parts individually. And I recommend doing that quite frequently, especially towards the end of your orchestration process, just to make sure that everyone is getting at least a decent slice of the cake. At the end of the day, do what works best for the sound of your piece as well as the meaning of it. But always remember that it is the players that make the piece sound the way it is. And if you give them crappy parts, they may not play to their fullest, they may not want to. So make sure you give them fair stuff to play, and your piece will sound quite fine because of that. Keep making better music.